Olha, vai ter festa em Olinda, livros contando histórias, pra guardar na memória, a Fliporto que vem aportar em Olinda.
Recebam com uma salva de palmas a palestrante dessa noite, Eva Esteves. Contamos também Moacir Escuria.
Bom, eu vou falar pouco, porque eu acho que a gente deve aproveitar essa chance rara de ouvir a sobrevivente de uma das maiores tragédias do século XX, que foi o Holocausto, né? E a palavra de um dos escritores brasileiros mais importantes, Moacir Escuria, que tem ideias interessantes sobre esse assunto. Eu não vou bancar o santinho aqui, eu vou confessar que jornalista gosta de tragédia, todo mundo sabe, né? E eu me lembro que eu convivi durante 20 anos com aquele que é considerado o maior repórter brasileiro, Joel Silveira. Ele foi correspondente de guerra na Segunda Guerra Mundial e ele sempre dizia que ia carregar pelo resto da vida o cheiro de sangue e óleo. Foi o cheiro que ele trouxe da guerra. E ele dizia que chegou à guerra com 24 anos, passou alguns meses e voltou para casa se sentindo com 80 anos, como se tivesse visto e vivido uma vida inteira em tão pouco tempo. Mas o Joel dizia que, brincalhão como ele era, ele dizia: eu adoro uma guerra, a gente não quer que tragédias aconteçam, mas já que acontece, os jornalistas dão $1 milhão para falar. O Joel brincava, dizia: se me derem um passaporte, $500, eu vou viajar hoje de tarde para o Iraque para cobrir a guerra lá. E uma cena de... como jornalista, eu tive sempre uma curiosidade de um dia ouvir testemunhas do horror nazista, mas do lado dos vilões. E essa curiosidade foi atiçada depois que eu tive a chance rara, né, de entrevistar um promotor britânico que julgou, que pediu a condenação dos criminosos nazistas no Tribunal de Nuremberg. Chamava-se Hartley Shawcross, era um homem de quase 2 metros de altura. A gente entrevistou, eu me lembro que ele disse uma coisa que me marcou muito. Ele disse: olha, se você... Ele obviamente encarou todos os criminosos nazistas, né, os grandes criminosos foram condenados à forca em Nuremberg, e ele disse a certa altura da entrevista: se você entrasse no ônibus, todos eles estivessem dentro do ônibus, você não olharia de novo para nenhum deles, porque nenhum deles chamaria a atenção. Ele confirmou aquela teoria da banalidade do mal, né? E a gente às vezes faz aquela coisa de cinema, de filme de Hollywood, que os carrascos nazistas são monstros sanguinários que avançam. Ele disse que não. Essa impressão foi mais forte, mais íntima, que ele trouxe do Tribunal de Nuremberg. E agora, nem faz tanto tempo, eu tive a chance de entrevistar finalmente 2 pessoas do time dos vilões, vamos dizer assim. Um foi um homem que vive um drama inacreditável até hoje. Ele é filho de um dos maiores criminosos nazistas, o Hans Frank. Em última instância, o Hans Frank, o pai do Nicholas Frank, foi responsável pelo que acontecia e pelo que aconteceu aos prisioneiros de Auschwitz. Entre eles, nós temos aqui uma sobrevivente. E o filho de Hans Frank, Nicholas Frank, ele é um personagem fascinante porque ele é uma exceção. Ele até hoje provoca um incômodo na Alemanha ao dizer aos alemães que não adianta a Alemanha tentar comparar o Holocausto com outros crimes, porque o Holocausto é um crime tipicamente alemão e não existe nada igual. E ele publicou um livro sobre esse assunto, é um livro em que ele declara guerra ao pai. Até hoje ele diz que o motivo da vida dele é destruir a memória do pai. Então ele é um personagem jornalisticamente fascinante, né? E ele toca num tema delicado e complexo, que é o da culpa coletiva, o conceito da culpa coletiva dos alemães. E eu me lembro que no meio da entrevista, uma cena que me chamou a atenção é que ele foi lá dentro, trouxe uma caixa de fotografias, abriu a caixa e tinha fotos do pai dele com Hitler, a foto do pai dele no Tribunal de Nuremberg. E a gente tem sempre aquela sensação de: meu Deus, aconteceu tanto horror, tanta coisa para terminar numa caixa de velhas fotografias. Ele diz que não, né? Aquilo não deveria acabar apenas com a caixa de velhas fotografias, tanto é que ele resolveu fazer essa campanha pública até hoje contra o pai. Então, como filho, ele se sentiu na obrigação de denunciar. Como jornalista, eu me sinto na obrigação de ouvi-lo, né? E como vítima da intolerância, a nossa convidada de hoje se sentiu na obrigação de contar o que ela viveu num livro que eu recomendo a todos, que é uma leitura fascinante. Eu li numa noite assim. Então essa tarefa de construção da memória é interminável, né? Isso vai durar as próximas gerações. E eu, como jornalista, tenho uma fascinação por isso, que eu acho que não existe assunto esgotado. Então eu vou fazer uma pergunta bem direta. A senhora perdoa?
It's an easy question. No, I don't forgive. Not at all. Those people were not how you expect a human being to act. I have no hatred against the German people in general now. I've been to Germany. I've just come back from Germany. And a young man came to me and asked me, he was 19 years old, he said to me, "Do you hate me?" And I said, "Hate you? Why should I hate you?" He said, "Because I'm German," he said. And I said, "No, you're innocent. You have nothing to do with what your great-grandparents did." But this is still a guilt feeling in Germany by the new generation of young people. The Germans entered Austria. Life in Austria started to change immediately. I went after school to my best friend, who was a Catholic little girl. When the mother saw me, she slammed the door in my face and said, "We don't want to see you here anymore in our house." I went home crying. I said to my mother, "We didn't have a quarrel, we didn't understand." And my mother said, "From now on, for Jewish people, life is going to be very, very difficult." Because, all right, in Holland many people did help us, but we were betrayed by a Dutch nurse who betrayed more than 200 Jewish innocent people from them to death. So I didn't know anymore who to trust or who not to trust. But when I wrote my book in 1986, I was still very bitter. Like Nicholas Frank said, he thinks of his father every day. I think of my father every day and of my brother, who was 17 years old when he was murdered by the Nazis. So for many, many years I was full of hatred. But now I never get over my loss. But I have accepted it now, my own suffering I got over. And my opinion is now there are very bad people in this world, but as well many, many more wonderful people.
A senhora escreveu: "Eu não conseguia entender por que, com 15 anos, eu era uma pessoa indesejável simplesmente por ser judia." A pergunta é a seguinte: quando e com que idade a senhora conseguiu entender, se é que conseguiu?
No, this is a question I ask myself all the time. Why are the Jewish people persecuted through the centuries? I know this German soldier said he thought he was the chosen people. We Jews think as well we are the chosen people. I know the South African Boers thought they are the chosen people. But chosen people are not chosen people. Every person is who he is. If it's a decent person, he has a right to live. So you can't condemn a whole people. The same as I don't condemn the German people as a whole. You have to choose a decent person. If he's a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, it doesn't matter. There shouldn't be prejudice against the whole people just because they have a different religion or a different color.
Por uma incrível coincidência, a casa onde a senhora estava escondida na Holanda foi invadida pela Gestapo no dia em que a senhora completava 15 anos de idade. E todo mundo sabe que uma festa de 15 anos é marcante na vida de qualquer garota, né? Eu queria saber qual é a lembrança mais forte que a senhora guarda desse aniversário tão traumático.
Yes, we were betrayed, and it just happened to be my 15th birthday. We went down to breakfast. I got a little present from my mother, and I thought this might be a happier day. It was May 1944. We had been in hiding already for 2 years. and there was big knocking on the door, and the Nazis stormed in the house. As soon as they arrested us, I thought that will be the end of my life. I really thought in a day or two I won't be alive anymore. That is a horrific thought for a 15-year-old child.
Agora a senhora passou 2 anos escondida no sótão. A senhora passou 2 anos escondida no sótão. A senhora pode descrever um dia típico nessas condições? O que é que a senhora fazia?
I think most of you have read the diary of Anna Frank. You know they were hiding for 2 years. There were 8 people there. In daytime they had to be very quiet because the office people were there. But in the evenings they could walk around, they could talk, they could study. There was a young boy as well. There were families. So it was bad, but it was not as bad as I was hiding with my mother because we had to separate. My father and brother were in a different place. I was with my mother. I was a very sportive child. I liked to be outside. I liked swimming and skiing and mountain climbing. And suddenly I was put up with one person for 2 years. Every day is the same thing. Be quiet the whole day. I didn't like reading at the time, so it was extremely boring. And at night the Nazis did house searches. We had a hiding place within the hiding place where we went when the Nazis came searching the houses. So every day we were wondering what will happen this night. Will they find us? What will happen then? Will they kill us? Because when you were hiding, you were a special case. You got an S on your paper for Strafe, punishment. So they could have killed you on the spot. So the anxiousness was just unbelievable.
Agora a senhora fez a viagem para o campo de concentração de Auschwitz de trem, nas condições mais desumanas que a gente pode imaginar, né? Queria saber o seguinte, quando o trem parava, a senhora tentava falar com os guardas? Se tentava, o que é que eles respondiam?
We were transported like animals, not like human beings. So as soon somebody spoke to the Nazis when they opened the door to throwing food like you would feel lions in a cage. There was a pregnant woman in our corner who was giving birth. We asked for help. He said, "You Jew pigs, you don't need any help. You just die. You'll be killed anyway." There was no sympathy, no feelings of any of those people, ever.
Foi o que aconteceu com essa mulher grávida?
The baby died, of course, and the woman was selected at arrival in Auschwitz, and she was gassed.
A senhora, uma das primeiras coisas que aconteceram com a senhora na chegada ao campo foi a tatuagem. A senhora ainda tem a tatuagem no braço?
Yes, it is something which will stay for me forever. There were some people after the war who had it removed, but it cost money and it needed a skin graft, so we never were able to do that. And now it is proof. Because unfortunately, there are still people, even now, who deny that the Holocaust ever happened. So if ever somebody would confront me, I would put my number under his nose.
A senhora pode mostrar? Se incomodaria de mostrar? Qual é o número?
It's A5272.
A senhora diz no livro que tinha inveja das mulheres que desmaiavam no campo de concentração, porque, suas palavras, a inconsciência teria sido um grande alívio. Em que momento a senhora achou que preferia estar morta no campo?
Well, this was really the reason, one of the reasons that I did survive, that I wanted to live. I realized that life had so much to offer. We had a wonderful family relationship in Austria with a big extended family, and I really wanted to experience that as well. So I wanted to live. this was really which gave me the hope and the courage to carry on from day to day. But it would have been nice to miss out on a few days and not suffer the whole time. And especially the hunger. Getting no food, you were really going mad from hunger.
A senhora teve um contato no campo de concentração com um notório e temidíssimo criminoso nazista que terminou se refugiando no Brasil, o Joseph Mengele. Que lembrança a senhora tem desse ponto?
Unfortunately, I encountered them several times. First of all, at arrival, there was the first selection which took place. Men, different parts and women. And he stood there with white gloves, polished boots, with a little stick in his arm like a conductor. He looked you over and he conducted you to this side or this side. And he condemned people to death, young children, babies, older people. Old was perhaps 45, 50. I remember him very clearly standing there. It's the worst time happened when one day, after we came out of a shower, naked, he stood there and we had to parade naked in front of him. And he looked us over and I passed to the good side. And my mother, who was a very tall lady, and like any mother would do, she had often given me a piece of her bread ration, and she had become really very, very thin. And he looked her over, and he condemned her to the wrong side. About 40 people from our transport were taken to a death barrack to wait to be gassed. For 3 months, I thought I had lost my mother, but through a miracle she was saved. But this is, I remember always Mengele, his hard eyes looking as if she's not a human being.
A senhora recebeu a tarefa de procurar na roupa dos prisioneiros executados alguns pertences que eles tinham tentado esconder. O que é que a senhora encontrou na roupa deles?
We arrived in Auschwitz in May. In June 1944, the Hungarian Jews were rounded up. And every day, thousands of Jewish people came to camp. So my mother and me were taken to a certain work. It was called Canada, sort of the nickname for plenty and better life. And that is where we had to sort out the belonging, which was confiscated of the people who arrived, and we had to open out the hems of the garments because people had brought gold or jewelry or money. We had to find them and hand it over to the Nazis. But as well, we had to look through the suitcases, sort out everything, and I found many, many photos because that was something you took with you, belonging. Photo album, and I remember clearly there was a photo of a beautiful baby, and I knew that baby had been killed immediately as arrival. So the work was not harm, but emotionally it nearly killed you.
Quando a senhora foi libertada finalmente, quando os russos chegaram ao campo de concentração, a senhora descreve no livro uma cena interessantíssima, que o grupo de prisioneiros esquálidos, nas piores condições, quando eles chegaram numa cidade próxima, eles imediatamente foram para o cinema, sentiram a necessidade de ver um filme. Eu gostaria de saber como é que a senhora explica essa necessidade, naquelas condições mais terríveis. O que é que a senhora esperava ver ao entrar no cinema?
Well, me as a young person in Holland already, in 1940 when the Nazis entered Holland, we were not allowed to go anymore to the cinema. And it was just Walt Disney had just brought out the first film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And all the children, the non-Jewish children, went to see this film. And the Jewish children couldn't go to this film. So I remember always I wish I could have gone to the cinema. And after the Russians had liberated us, we were traveling 4 months with the Russians to the east because the war was not finished. And we came to Chernovitz, which was a Romanian town. And the train stopped there and we were able to go into the town. And we passed the cinema. And I said to my mother, I must go to see a film. After all this suffering of being cooped up, a film was something out of another world. It was sort of a relief.
O filho do carrasco nazista diz que se lembra do pai todo dia. Com que frequência a senhora se lembra de Auschwitz, quando não existe um repórter por perto perguntando?
I speak now a lot in school. I spent already for over 20 years. I go into schools, I go into prisons, I travel to America, to Germany, in England. And so, of course, I speak a lot about this terrible time. So I think about it all the time. But of course, if I go to a play, or we have a family reunion, and I love life, I go to music, to concerts, of course I don't think about it. For many, many years it was always in my head, because I didn't speak about it. But once you were able to speak about it, it's not so much with you anymore. But like I said before, the person, the people you have lost, is something you will never forget.
Pois eu entendi bem, alguém estranhou eu ter pedido para ela mostrar a tatuagem, mas no livro ela conta que ela fez questão de manter a tatuagem e ela faz questão de mostrar é uma prova física do que ela passou em Auschwitz e na intolerância. Então eu acho que eu não fui desrespeitoso ao pedir que ela exibisse a tatuagem, porque é uma coisa que ela faz questão de manter. Bom, eu queria... O Moacir Sclier fez um texto muito bom, ele falando do sentimento de culpa dos sobreviventes. Os que escaparam do campo de concentração, muitos passaram o resto da vida se torturando e se perguntando por que eu escapei se tantos morreram. Então eu queria que ele falasse sobre esse sentimento de culpa dos sobreviventes, como é que ele vê isso, e a gente podia perguntar a ela depois se ela tem esse sentimento também.
Em primeiro lugar, eu quero agradecer a Perporto. Esse convite é a segunda vez que eu venho e vejo esse evento cada vez maior, cada vez melhor organizado. É realmente um evento que coloca o Brasil no mapa cultural do mundo. Portanto, Pernambuco, Cidade Unida, Perporto estão de parabéns por esse evento e, sobretudo, pela escolha desse tema. É um tema que não perde nunca a atualidade, ainda que, como disse o Geneton, frequentemente ele seja distorcido e nos últimos tempos nós temos visto, inclusive, várias tentativas nesse sentido. Quero também saudar a Eva, que eu conheci agora, e sempre como Geneton, eu li o livro dela no golpe, porque realmente o livro é muito bom. Muita gente vai inevitavelmente comparar com o livro da Anne Frank, mas é diferente. O livro da Anne Frank é mais a Anne Frank, a personagem, a pessoa que ela é, uma pessoa fascinante. O livro da Eva é muito mais o relato, que eu diria até quase factual do que aconteceu, cuja leitura, por vezes, se torna absolutamente insuportável. Precisa ter estômago para ler. E aqui está falando um médico que não viu poucas coisas horríveis na vida, né? Mas eu devo dizer para vocês que a descrição dela, em alguns momentos, chega ao nível bem insuportável. Bom, eu quero também me referir a essa bela entrevista que o Geneton fez, e sobretudo aquele soldado. Houve um momento assim que me tocou, né? O fato de que ele mencionou a Rússia. Acontece que meus pais eram da Rússia, né? Como era a Clarissa, que viveu aqui em Recife. Meus pais, com as famílias deles e muitas outras famílias, eles saíram da Rússia nas primeiras décadas do século XX e vieram para Recife. para o que era para eles um verdadeiro paraíso, que era a América, o Brasil, o Rio Grande do Sul, em especial, onde eles se radicaram no interior do Rio Grande do Sul, primeiro colônias agrícolas, depois vários deles mudaram para a cidade, e foi na cidade de Porto Alegre, no bairro do Bonfim, que eu cresci. Cresci, tive uma infância, era uma família pobre, mas era uma infância feliz, né? E muitas vezes eu me perguntei, né, o que teria acontecido se meus pais não tivessem vindo no Brasil. Se eles fossem daqueles que ficaram na Rússia, que talvez, já adultos, eles não teriam escapado dos campos de extermínio, como a maioria deles não escapou. E talvez junto com eles, a família deles, talvez um filho, não chamado Moacir, mas com o nome russo que eles teriam lá, e que certamente não escaparia também das câmaras de gás. A guerra era uma lembrança constante para nós. Eu era criança, quando da Segunda Guerra, mas a gente vivia essa realidade. Eu tive um primo, o artista plástico Carlos Esclia, muito famoso nesse país, que foi em pracinha, serviu na Força Expedicionária Brasileira, lutou na Itália, e dele nós tínhamos então notícias. Mas uma coisa interessante é o seguinte, que a guerra vivida por nós, meninos do Bonfim, era uma coisa lúdica. Era aquilo que a gente via nos filmes do cinema Baltimore. Diferente da época, a gente podia ir ao cinema. O cinema era de uma família judia. E a gente via aqueles filmes, que mostravam, era um esquema mocinhos contra bandidos. Isso também orientava as nossas brincadeiras. O nosso conhecimento do Holocausto era zero. Mesmo no final da Segunda Guerra Mundial e mesmo depois que terminou a Segunda Guerra. Aos poucos as notícias foram chegando ao Brasil e aos poucos elas foram chegando ao bairro bom. Nossos pais procuravam nos poupar sobre isso. A gente via eles às vezes pelos campos cochichando, falando baixinho. A gente não sabia exatamente do que se tratava, mas aos poucos a gente foi deduzindo. E quando a brutal verdade emergiu, inevitavelmente ela emergiu com um sentimento de culpa. Os psicólogos norte-americanos têm um nome para isso, chamam survival, a culpa do sobrevivente. Não é uma culpa que se refere só ao Holocausto, mas é a culpa daqueles que sobrevivem a catástrofes, seja naturais, seja resultantes de genocídio, e é o caso de muitas pessoas que, por alguma razão semelhante aos meus pais, ou talvez um pouco diferente, conseguiram escapar da mortandade. E é muito curioso, entre esses, tinha vários intelectuais, e é curioso que o braço longo da culpa alcançou essas pessoas quando elas já estavam distantes daquela realidade e distantes daqueles lugares. E frequentemente o suicídio foi a solução que essas pessoas encontraram. Você tem, aqui no Brasil nós temos o caso do Stefan Zweig, da mulher dele, um escritor judeu austríaco que se refugiou no Brasil, e que, diante do que ele considerava o domínio inevitável do nazismo, ele acabou junto com a esposa se matando. Não foi o único. Arthur Kessler também, que foi durante muito tempo membro do Partido Comunista e depois foi um jornalista combativo, também se matou junto com a mulher dele. O poeta Paul Celan, autor de versos assombrosos sobre o Holocausto. Um deles ele fala no negro leite da morte. Uma imagem terrível, você pode imaginar. O leite, que é a coisa que evoca a figura materna, que evoca a nutrição, que evoca a proteção, que é branco, de repente ele se torna um líquido negro e mortal. E só isso, só essa frase resume o Holocausto, pois Paulsen também se matou, assim como o psicólogo Bruno Bettelheim, também ele um sobrevivente do nazismo. Então, essa culpa do sobrevivente, né, é apenas uma das terríveis repercussões que teve o genocídio nazista, né, e é uma razão a mais para que jamais esqueçamos o que aconteceu.
A senhora em algum momento teve um sentimento parecido, um sentimento de se culpar por ter escapado?
Well, I must admit, no. I know when you lose your children, like Otto Frank or my mother, who survived their own children, those people definitely feel guilt, because in the Jewish Bible it is mentioned you shouldn't survive your own children. That is a terrible thing. I must say I very often question why I was the one who survived in our family. My brother was much more talented than I. My father was a much stronger person than I. But it was me who survived. So I question. But I must admit I was much too pleased that I did have survived and that I had a chance to make a new life for myself.
Que tipo de relação a família da senhora tinha com a família de Anne Frank antes da prisão? Porque o pai da Anne Frank casou com a mãe dela depois da guerra.
Ambos vivos, importante dizer.
Ambos viúvos, é claro.
Well, we came from Austria to Holland in 1940, and we moved to a square in Amsterdam, the Remedeplein, where many Jewish refugees lived. And I was 11 years old when we got there. And after school, the children all came out and played on the square. And one day a little girl came and introduced herself. She was well brought up and said her name was Anne Frank. She came from Germany as well. And she will take me up to her family who could speak German with me, because I couldn't speak Dutch very well yet. And so that I met her family, and we were friends for 2 years. We played every day after school together, and we talked about boys. We played skipping, all the games which little girl played. But Anne was quite a different type as I was. I was a wild child. I was more like a boy. And Anne was already a very sophisticated little girl. She was very interested in her hairstyle, in clothes, in film stars. And so I admired her. She had always a lot of stories to tell. She always had a whole group of children around her. But I was still very shy because I'd gone through a very difficult time. The Frank family came already to Holland in 1933 when Anne was 4, so she hadn't really experienced much difficulties. But I had been already condemned as a Jew, and we had been in Belgium first, where the people didn't welcome refugees, and to learn French first, and so I had already a very difficult time. So for 2 years we knew each other till both our families, our older siblings, my brother, who was 16 years at the time, and Anne's sister Margot, got a call-up notice to report to a certain point to be deported to Germany to a work camp. And that was the time when many Jewish families decided they wouldn't send their children, but we would go into hiding. We didn't know that the Frank had gone hiding, and they didn't know about us. We never talked about anything like that, because all the Dutch people they hated the Germans, had after all invaded their country. Nevertheless, in 1942, Germany was victorious, and there were many, many people who thought the Germans will win the war, and so many took sides with the Germans and became Dutch Nazis. And those were the people who later betrayed many, many Jewish people.
O pai da Anne Frank passou a frequentar a casa da senhora depois da guerra. Que lembrança a senhora tem da descoberta dos famosos diários da Anne Frank?
Well, he was a wonderful person. We came back in June 1945 through Russia. We were 4 months in Russia. Just telling you about the Russians, we saw unbelievable devastation which the Germans had created. But the Russians treated us with respect, fed us and clothed us. We know that when they went into Germany, they raped and looted and did terrible things. But the victims of the Nazis are treated really very, very well. So I have great love for the Russians. So I know that the leader, Stalin, did nearly the same horrors as Hitler did. But the people, the Russian people, are wonderful people. I love them dearly. And so what was the question?
Que lembrança a senhora tem da descoberta dos
So
diários?
eventually we came back to Holland after 6 months on the road, and we waited for news from our family. Everywhere there were posters and adverts in newspapers to look for certain people. And one day we got a notice from the Red Cross that both my father and brother had died in Mauthausen, an Austrian concentration camp, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. You can imagine my mother and me were just devastated. A few days later, Otto Frank came as well, telling us that he had heard that his wife and both his daughters had perished. He was 57 years old at the time, and after he left, I sat on my mother's lap and we cried. And my mother said, well, at least we have each other, but this poor man, how can he carry on with his life? He has nothing really to live for. And a few days later he came again and he had a brown parcel in his arm. And he said, I must show you something. And he opened it very, very carefully, and it was Anna's diary. And this little book gave him a purpose in his life again. He was very, very proud. He showed it to everybody. And he always said, I feel as if my little girl is still with me. Nevertheless, in later years, he always said, I feel very guilty. I had, after all, 2 daughters. But I always speak about Anna and never about Margot. But Anna was just with him all the time.
Qual foi a impressão que a senhora teve quando leu pela primeira vez os diários? Foi igual que o Moacir Sclia teve de alguns trechos insuportáveis?
Well, no, because she wrote the diary before she had been transported to Auschwitz. So she writes really about her development from a little girl into a woman, about the quarrels they had with the 8 people, about her relationship with the first love with the young boy Peter, about her unfortunately very bad relationship with her mother, about the dentist who was in hiding. She was very critical, and so it was a completely different book, like my book. But you said it was very difficult to read my book. Well, of course it is. But on the other hand, people say, so you tell about the facts. Your book is nevertheless a book, an uplifting book, because it speaks of hope and courage and survival. Elie Wiesel's book is a dark book, Night, about death, about the questioned existence of God. My book is sad, but nevertheless it has hope, and that is very important in this difficult world.
Sim, a senhora citou no início rapidamente o fato de que a sua família foi vítima de uma traição na Holanda quando foi capturada. A senhora poderia explicar melhor em que circunstâncias se deu essa traição?
Well, that's quite a complicated story. We have to change hiding places in the 2 years about 5-6 times, because, like I said, the Nazis did house searches, and we had a hiding place within a hiding place. People from the resistance came and looked for a partition where they could make, or under the floorboards, or somewhere where people could hide when the Nazis come. So people became very nervous. So after a year and a half, or after sometimes even a few weeks, they said, I'm sorry, I can't take the tension. You have to look for a different hiding place. My father and brother was in the country with a woman who started to blackmail them. She wanted more money. And as the war was dragging on already for 2 years, after we'd been in hiding, it was already 5 years, but 2 years in hiding, we ran out of money, and my father said, well, if the war goes on and we have no money, this woman will throw us out. So we got in touch with people from the resistance and found a new hiding place, and this the Dutch nurse came forward and said she knew the safe house, but this was really a trap. This Dutch nurse took my father and brother to this address, which was really a trap where the Nazis were. And we had visited them because they come to Amsterdam, and they followed us, so all 4 of us were betrayed. We were 3 days in a Dutch camp and then immediately sent to Auschwitz.
Vocês vão ver no livro, ela cita realmente, como Moacir cita, cenas terríveis, né? Você, o que foi que mais marcou você, sem precisar descrever necessariamente as cenas, qual foi a passagem que mais chocou você?
Ela faz uma descrição extremamente realista, extremamente, às vezes até objetiva, assim, né? Das torturas pelas quais ela passou, né? Das humilhações, dos sofrimentos, né? As condições de higiene eram terríveis, né? E as doenças pelas quais eles passavam, a sujeira que eles viviam, a fome constante, essas coisas realmente assim impressionam o leitor. E é bom que a gente se lembre que essas coisas aconteceram. Agora eu queria fazer uma pergunta para ela, né? Viu, Janetão? Fazer uma pergunta para ela, que é o seguinte: o tema do Diário da Anne Frank é um tema que constantemente volta à tona. Agora mesmo tem no Rio uma peça, né? E acaba de sair pela editora Zahara um livro muito interessante de uma crítica literária americana chamada Francine Prose, que é uma análise da trajetória do Diário de Anne Frank, né? E aí vem a minha pergunta para ela. O diário, no começo, é uma coisa curiosa, ele foi recusado sistematicamente pelos editores, que achavam que não teria mercado para esse tipo de livro, né? Achavam que as pessoas não estavam querendo ouvir falar na guerra, que aquilo era uma coisa muito particular, que não interessava ao público norte-americano, né? Ou seja, erraram, né, feio nesse cálculo deles, né? Depois o livro foi adaptado para o teatro e foi adaptado também para o cinema, né? E as adaptações, né, mais a de teatro, mas também a de cinema, foram muito criticadas por causa dentro de uma ótica, né, que se faz muito em relação ao cinema e à dramaturgia americana, que eles pasteurizam, né, que eles neutralizam, que eles tratam de, vamos dizer assim, adoçar um pouco as coisas, né, minimizar um pouco a brutalidade dos fatos, né, para não perder público. E a peça em especial foi criticada por causa disso, mas também o filme. A minha pergunta para Eva é se ela chegou a ver essas adaptações, né, e se concorda com o fato de que há nelas elementos que distorcem o Diário de Anne Frank.
Well, this is a very good question. Why the diary became so popular in 1952 when it was published in America was because by that time people started to want to know what was happening, but they didn't want to know too much. It was still too painful, and there was as well a guilt. I think the American people, the British people, felt guilty that they hadn't done anything. It was well known what was happening in the many, there were 300 death camps and concentration camps. The governments did know, and there was a great guilt feeling by Jewish people in America, by everybody really. So this was a book which gave some information, but it didn't go too deep. when the film and the play came out, Otto had a court case because it's a complicated story. There was a Jewish writer, Meyer Levine, who wrote the first adaptation, and it was much more serious, it was much more Jewish, but nobody wanted to produce it because they knew that the audience wasn't ready to see that. So it was rejected. There is now in America, in San Francisco, a play about this Meyer Levine. It's called Compulsion, about that killed him, that he wasn't able to have his play, which was actually much better than the Albert Hackett play, but it was rejected because it was too serious. And it is true, there are many passages in the play which never happened really, but in a play you have to make it exciting. And so Otto compromised. He didn't really want it, but he was convinced that to make it knowledgeable to the people, he had to give in with sometimes with the truth. But Otto never saw the play nor the film. But it was a difficult choice. Now, of course, such a play would be welcomed.
Gostaria de saber uma curiosidade que a senhora trata no seu livro, mas em que altura da sua permanência em Auschwitz a senhora tomou conhecimento da existência das câmaras de gás lá dentro? Quantos dias depois que a senhora chegou, a senhora descobriu que os prisioneiros que eram encaminhados para o banho, na verdade, iam ser executados?
Oh yes, nobody really tried to hide this from us. On the contrary, they told us with great pleasure. After the first selection, like I described, this side or this side, all the young children, all the older people went to one side. When we entered the camp and we had to undress naked, we were tattooed, all our hair was shaved, they told us, the family you have been separated from are already being killed. And they told us exactly what was happening, and they loved hurting us. They told us people were getting a piece of soap and a towel. They were told they were going to go in a shower, and they did go. And they stood there were pipes with shower heads, and they expected water to come, but nothing happened. And after several minutes, people started to have breathing difficulty. They couldn't breathe, they collapsed. They were killed. And this happened continuously, and they told us at arrival. And then we were told, and now it's your time to go in the shower. You can imagine we didn't want to go. We were beaten into it. But in our case, water came. But then people were cremated. And from day one, we saw outside, there were many chimneys. We saw at night, we saw huge flames. And in daytime we smelled the burning of flesh. So there was no way we didn't know what was going on.
A senhora foi informada então imediatamente depois de chegar no campo.
And so did the Polish people, because all the concentration camps in Poland and Germany were built right next to towns. The town of Auschwitz was right next to the concentration camp. But so the people who lived there knew exactly what was going on in the camp. Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, it's all in proximity of German and Polish towns.
Vários ex-prisioneiros fazem questão de viver a experiência de voltar, visitar o campo de concentração. O campo de Dachau, por exemplo, hoje há vários monumentos de várias religiões, é até bonito, eu visitei lá. Aparece a frase "nunca mais", escrita em vários idiomas, é uma homenagem aos sobreviventes. Eu queria saber se a senhora teve esse impulso de visitar Auschwitz de novo. Se visitou, por que visitou, e se não, por que também?
I never wanted to visit. I had such nightmares from this for many, many years, and I knew it was a horrific place, so why should I go back? In 1995, when it was the first time that the free world were able to make a big memorial service there, the Dutch television asked me to do a program with them. They phoned me in London, and I refused them straight out. And he said, well, I knew you would say that, but think it over, perhaps you change your mind. We're going to phone you again in a few days. And my mother was still alive at the time, and I talked it over with my husband, and they both said, no, you must definitely not go there. But I was thinking, perhaps when I go there, I can close up this period in my life. And the one plus thing was that some of the Russian officers who had liberated us were going to be there. So I decided I would go. I went with my husband. It was January. It was a very bleak, snowy day. And the minute we got out of the car, my husband burst into tears. And from beginning to the end, it was a half an hour filming. He just cried the whole time. And me as well. I remembered everything, just as horrible as I thought it was. And Auschwitz is one of the few concentration camps which is still there. The barracks are there, the barbed wire, the entrance, the railway line. Because most camps, there's really nothing much to see. They're just museums. It is a problem now. Should they keep the camp going? Because the barracks are in disrepair, they're falling to bits. Should they repair it? Should they make it like new? And the Polish government doesn't want to pay for it, so the world has to contribute to this. So there are many disputes, but I think at least one camp, and Auschwitz being the worst, should be there as a memorial to the 3 million people who were killed there. And it wasn't only Jewish people. Many other groups, gypsies, disabled people, gay people, Jehovah's Witnesses, many other groups were killed there. 3 million Poles as well. So it is something which is really a memorial for the whole world.
Bom, a gente pode imaginar, obviamente, o sentimento de alívio que a senhora teve quando descobriu que os russos chegaram para libertar o campo de concentração, libertar os prisioneiros. Em que momento exatamente a senhora descobriu que o campo tinha sido tomado, os alemães tinham ido embora? Qual foi a cena que deu à senhora a ideia de liberdade?
Well, you know, very often people ask me, liberation, did you really realize you had survived? How was it? And I say, it wasn't dramatic at all. For many weeks, the German had taken many of the inmates out of Auschwitz because they knew the Russians were approaching. We didn't know that. And later, after the war, those were called the death marches because many tens of thousands of people perished on marches into Germany and Austria. Just by luck and by fluke, my mother and me didn't go on those marches. We stayed behind. And one day we woke up and it was very quiet, and we went outside and all the Germans had left. And it was midwinter. Poland has a very severe winter. The snow was that high, and there were about, in Auschwitz-Birkenau was a women's camp, there were about 300 women left, most of them too ill really to get out of their bunks. And we didn't really know what has happened. We didn't know were the Germans coming back. The rumor had been spread that when the Germans were leaving eventually, they are going to lock up the barracks, they were wood, and burn the whole camp down so as not to leave any signs over. And so nobody really wanted to stay behind. And we lived like that for about 10 days. There were no Russians. The Germans had even come back one day and took more people with them, and my mother included. She was taken away, but she had the amazing idea. She threw herself in the snow, and the Germans left, and she came back to the camp to be with me. That was again a horrible experience for me. I thought she was gone now. And so eventually, one day I walked around and saw at the gate. The gate was open, we could have left, but we didn't dare to go out. And huge figures stood there, all in icicles and fur, and I thought first it was a bear. But when I looked close, I realized it was the first Austrian soldier. He was a scout, a forerunner to see what was happening, but he made us understood he couldn't stay, and more Russians would come and they would look after us eventually. So this is what happened. We went then to Auschwitz, to the men camp, to try to find my father and my brother, but they had gone on those transport. Although at this time we had still great hopes that they would be alive. But I found somebody else I had known, and that was Otto Frank. Of course, the first question was, have you seen my family? And of course we hadn't seen them.
A Eva disse uma coisa muito importante, eu acho que a gente deve sublinhar, porque realmente, ao fim e ao cabo, talvez seja a mensagem mais importante, né? Quando ela diz que o Holocausto não foi o único genocídio. O Holocausto foi diferente, né? Diferente no sentido assim de que foi um massacre organizado em bases industriais, no esquema linha de montagem, né? Com uma burocracia perfeita. E as pessoas que presenciaram isso salientam esse fato assim de como as listas tinham que estar meticulosamente organizadas. Quando o Mengele, por exemplo, recebia um trem, ele ficava absolutamente furioso se a contagem dos prisioneiros não coincidia com a lista que ele tinha, né? E depois, uma das coisas que aconteceu também com Eichmann, né? Cujo julgamento foi presenciado pela Hannah Arendt, de onde surgiu a expressão banalidade do mal, né? Que é uma expressão que naquela época ficou muito controversa, mas que define exatamente isso, porque aquele homem era um banal, ele era um burocrata, né? Sem imaginação, que de fato cumpria ordens. Ele passou o julgamento inteiro impassível, né? Ele não dizia absolutamente nada, ele não se emocionava com nada. Teve um instante só, né, que ele ficou perturbado, um único instante, né? Foi quando o juiz o repreendeu, porque o juiz tinha mandado que ele ficasse de pé e ele não ficou, né? E o juiz repreendeu porque ele não tinha cumprido uma ordem. E isso feriu profundamente, né? O fato de que ele próprio não tinha cumprido uma ordem do tribunal, para ele era uma falta, talvez punível com a morte que ele acabou tendo, né? Mas, tirando esse aspecto, nós não podemos esquecer que genocídios existiram e continuam existindo, né? Nós tivemos o genocídio dos armênios, nós tivemos o genocídio dos ciganos, como a Eva mencionou, nós tivemos genocídio de minorias sexuais, nós tivemos genocídios na África de minorias étnicas, né? Nada disso foi organizado sistematicamente, mas nem por isso foi menos brutal. E também a potencialidade do genocídio, né, é uma coisa que está presente em muitas pessoas, né? E às vezes se manifesta assim de uma forma aparentemente insuspeita, né? Uma ofensa de tipo racial, uma brincadeira pesada, ou como foi mencionado aqui na abertura desse evento, né? Essas ameaças que estão sendo veiculadas através da internet contra nordestinos. Tudo isso faz parte do mesmo esquema de ódio, e se a gente quiser valorizar as vítimas do Holocausto, a gente tem que se lembrar que também para essas coisas nós temos que dizer nunca mais.
Bom, eu acho que a gente já está abusando um pouco da boa vontade da nossa convidada, né? Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta ainda, já que eu não quero perder essa chance, né? A senhora era uma adolescente quando viveu o terror de um campo de concentração. Se uma adolescente brasileira hoje, de 14, 15 anos, perguntasse à senhora o que era aquilo, o que foi o Holocausto, o que é Auschwitz, o que é que a senhora responderia?
Well, the Holocaust was a crime against humanity, especially for the Jewish people. 6 million of our people were killed, and it was an unbelievable and unfounded hatred. And this is something which I've heard in Brazil. You live together with many different races, many different religions, and you have luckily no racism here. This is something we in Europe are trying to copy you. It is something which we try to achieve, but unfortunately we have a lot of problems. We have a lot of immigration, especially Muslim people who want to keep their own politics and their own laws in English and French and Dutch society, and it causes a lot of rifts. And many people think the situation looks very, very dangerous again. For many older people, even older than me, it looks as if the 30s is repeated again. And that is why we keep your example. We have taken in people from many, many countries over many generations, and have been able to assimilate them and live in harmony together. And this is what we are hoping achieving in the future. And I congratulate you for being able to achieve that. That is a wonderful thing you have been able to do over the many, many years.
Engraçado, no meio de tudo aquilo, 60 anos depois, ele se lembrou de um prisioneiro que ele executou, chamado Boris, na invasão da Rússia, que esse prisioneiro chegou para ele e disse: vocês podem matar quantas pessoas vocês quiserem, vocês vão me matar aqui, mas vocês não vão matar a ideia. Vocês não vão matar nossas ideias. Vocês são os porcos nazistas do Boris. Vocês são os porcos nazistas e a gente vai sobreviver no fim das contas. Esse soldado disse que foi embora e guardou esse nome, né? E houve depois, ele participou da execução de uma prisioneira, que foi uma mulher que botou uma bomba, botou uma bomba no lugar por onde o tanque alemão ia passar. Essa mulher foi capturada e ele disse, esse soldado, que eles faziam os julgamentos sumários, que era o seguinte: amarrava uma corda numa árvore, botava a prisioneira em cima de um caixão de madeira, e quando resolviam que o prisioneiro devia ser executado, um soldado vinha, chutava o caixão e a pessoa morria enforcada. E essa mulher virou para ele e fez um discurso parecido com o Boris. Até usa um minuto antes de morrer, disse: não adianta nada, vocês vão me matar aqui, mas vocês vão perder no fim das contas. E uma coisa que me impressionou é que 60 anos depois, diante do horror do nazismo e tudo, ele guardou esses dois nomes. Ele virou para mim e disse: o nome dela era Helena. Ele confessou 60 anos depois, ele disse: eu fiquei impressionado com a coragem daquela mulher. A gente, um bando de soldados da divisão Panzer alemães, e ela gritou até o final e disse que a gente não adiantava a gente matá-la, porque ela ia, que os ideais que iam sobreviver. Então eu queria só fechar dizendo que no fim das contas, eu acho que o que fica é Helena, Boris e Eva, que está aqui para dar esse testemunho de vida para a gente, né? Obrigado.
A bit now already, but I'm very happy that I've been invited to be here to this wonderful cultural book festival, and I'm very grateful for the Record Publishing Company to publish my book in Portuguese. A book where we all can learn how to behave. The German people were not all Nazis, but the people went along with the regime. And this is something which we mustn't do. We must question what is going on and not follow blindly. Like the Hitler Youth, they were brainwashed into following without thinking what they were doing. Very often people ask me, could this have happened in England as well? And I said, no. The English people might have gone along for a little while, but later they would have asked, is that the right thing to do? And they would have realized you can't just kill innocent people. So this is something, again, like you said, for the young people. Question, even if adults tell you something to do, question if it is the right thing, if you should follow. You don't just follow blindly an order. Thank you very much for hosting this wonderful
subject with the Jewish people. I'm very proud to be a Jew. We are only 15 million people in the world, and we have contributed in every field, in science, in art, in literature, and I hope we will be able to continue contributing to the good of the world for many, many centuries. Thank you very much.